Brought to you in association with Grendel Press. This is Werewolf the Podcast, a serial killer drama.
This is Werewolf the Podcast, and this is a difficult one to listen to for some people, but I think my artwork is something that we all need to know and learn about. I'm a werewolf, but I'm also an artist. I like to think I set my art studio up to do my essential world-changing work. It was the site of my best structured destruction of humanity, and in it I wouldn't be disturbed. Well, some would call it work. To me, it's just pleasurable exploring. There were several works in progress around the room, all of them at various stages of destruction, and I suppose you could talk about it as being construction as well, depending on your point of view. I'll talk you through one of my latest pieces. The crucifix, well, it hangs from the wall of my studio. It was taken from a medieval church in Poland. I'd removed that well-known fool who died for your sins, that, Jesus character, and he'd been replaced by her. I'd met Sally or Hallie or Ali through the BDSM world. Have you ever been on FetLife? FetLife is like a good website and a source of fun. If you need to find someone with some strange kink, you'll find them there. There's millions of people there and there's millions of kinks. Sally was 8 months pregnant and in her 20s, I guess. She was quite pretty, but a lost soul in life and would not really be missed from this life. I chose her for the pregnancy. I'd never had the experience of working with a pregnant piece before. Well, not knowingly anyway. I had her now on the cross, naked and somewhat ashamed. She was wired up there, not nailed as the saviour had been. I'd used surgical drill to make the sights to thread the wire through to hold her. I'd slightly sedated her for the process as she shook and fought me not to get onto the surgical bed. I hate it when these people have no idea of the importance of my work to the world. She was evidently selfish. Once she was unconscious and still on the gurney, I tied her down. The holes had to be very carefully located and sterile. I couldn't afford to hit arteries or veins. I also had to be careful not to let the bones become infected too quickly. I already had her on antibiotic mix through an IV to ensure that she would be infection-free for as long as possible. The surgical drill I bought is a fun thing to play with, and it pierces bone quickly and cleanly with little effort. I would put my first hole in the hands, then in the forearm, then the humerus, through the collarbone, and then the upper and lower jaws. The surgery required great dexterity and patience, and the thrill as the holes were drilled was, it's pretty orgasmic, to be honest. I made sure she was just sedated enough so that she could sense what was happening but not suffer too much pain and overload. I'd become quite an expert at anaesthetics, as I had practised on many works as I could, really. The squeal of the drill as it entered the bone and the smell of the freshly cut flesh had made me feel somewhat hungry and horny, but deliciously I held off from eating. To suffer was to learn and improve. She only gave a little moan as she felt the spinning bit pierce her flesh and touch her bone. It was pleasing to the ears to hear the electrical whine and the pitch of the note change as it went through the flesh, and it became even shriller as it cut into the bone. Each bone I pierced gave a noticeably different sound. Maybe it had something to do with the size of the bone and the way that the sound would differ. You know, like with pitch and stuff. Maybe not, but it sounded good. I could feel her pain and anguish. Even heavily sedated, she was responsive to the intrusion of the metal into her body. It was beautiful. Once the holes were drilled, I threaded the sterile surgical steel wire through them. She was sedated, but she flinched and shook as each wire was inserted and dragged through. At each entry and exit point, I wiped a little adrenaline on the wound to stop the bleeding and constrict the skin around the wound. This would limit the loss of blood and reduce the chances of infection. I was extremely impressed at her strength as I pushed the wire through her jaw. I could see a high level of clarity in her eyes. She knew exactly what was happening. As I threaded the wire, I held her eye contact. She tried to gasp, but I reassured her that it was all going to be okay and to lie still. She cooperated. Tears welled in her blue eyes, and I dipped my fingers in them and tasted them. Tears changed their flavour with the emotions felt. These were fear tears. The tingle on my tongue was delightful and sweet. The crucifix itself had been put on a pulley system, so once my work was complete, I could then mount her and a cross on the wall. Having her on the wall meant I could watch the piece as it developed through time. I'd linked up more IVs in a colostomy bag to help keep her clean and fed. Keeping her hydrated would be the priority. As I raised her on the wall, I stopped the sedative and the anaesthetic. She would soon start to feel the joy of the pain. Her pain would let the art develop in a much more real way. Before I started my last task, I waited for her to be fully awake and attentive. The piece would be the Madonna on the cross. She was 8 months pregnant, and this pregnancy would play a massive part in the artwork. After an hour or so, she lifted her eyelids. Her eyes were clear and focused 100% for the first time. I got up and began to tighten the system of wires that held her to the cross. In response to this, she screamed as the thin cabling became taut. Her body and head were drawn back tight to the cross. She did not try to struggle. Her struggling would make the pain much worse. Her body was now locked and immobile. Her eyes were the only things that she could move. They flashed around the room as though looking for help. I lowered the cross one more time so that I could do my final incisions and work. With the cross lowered, I could access her lower back, where I placed the cannula between her spine's bones to give her the epidural she would need to allow her to survive my subsequent surgery. Once the epidural had been given, I lifted the cross to an angle that I could access her abdomen. Her sex was shaved, so that was not a job I needed to do, and I painted on the antiseptic, cleaning the area above that, ready for my first incision. Before the first cut, I got up and reduced the tension in the wires that held her head in place. This meant that she could move it. It would be painful to move, but she could. Her jaws were also less constricted, so that she had some ability to communicate. I would get the feeling that she felt now. She seemed asleep or maybe unconscious, so I shook her head until her eyes fluttered open once more. She was about to scream, so I smothered her mouth with my right hand. As she became quiet and calm, I waved the scalpel before her eyes with my left hand. She looked at the blade and tried to shy away from it. She was shaking and crying and mewling like a skinned cat. The sound was very similar to that of a skinned cat, and I would know. Her eyes followed me as I walked back to the front of her body. They never left my own. She could not get away. She was sedated, slightly, and held tight enough that she could never get away physically. The nature of the sedation and the epidural also meant that she could not escape mentally. She would be awake and lucid through this process. I brought a seat forward, swung down my, somewhat unneeded mask. She probably wouldn't survive this process. And put on a pair of clear spectacles to stop anything from entering my eyes during the surgery. Before beginning, I asked her if she was ready. She shook her head. She tried to speak, but it was impossible to determine what she said. I had bought a very helpful textbook to help me with the next task. I now focused on the spot that would be the site of my first incision. It was just above the pubic bone and would be careful, very careful, and very deep. As I placed my hand on the flesh, she flinched, and I felt her heart rate rise. I smelt the hormones dumped into her system through the sweat that started to glisten on her skin. These were the little things that built the excitement for me. I started to slice from left to right along the top of the pubic bone. The skin parted beneath the sharpened blade, and the adipose tissue of her abdomen became visible in the cut. There was blood, but not too much for the size of the incision that I'd made. She was now bellowing her hatred at me, screaming and crying at the brutal things I was doing to her body. I was disappointed as I knew that she couldn't really feel any of the work that I was undertaking. She shook a little, which annoyed me as I was trying to get an immaculate cut. Then I realised that there was no requirement for this, as I wouldn't be fixing the mess once it had been done. There'd be no sewing up and recovery for this one. This made me feel a little bit better, but I still wanted to be very professional in this affair. This was being recorded for posterity. After all, she now shook a little less as I continued with my work. I looked back at the textbook that I had at my feet. I'd made the incision through the abdomen. I would now have to cut my way into the uterus to get to my prize. The little life and soul inside, the totally innocent and totally unprepared baby of this cheap whore. This artwork would be its life's work, and it would not be named but be remembered for this ultimate sacrifice, for the sake of beauty and for the education of the masses. I took my mask and goggles off and turned to the camera that was focused on her abdomen. It had automatic focus, so as I leant into it, it whirred and clicked as it refocused on me. I smiled at the camera. I hope it was a warm and friendly smile that I offered my audience. I turned back to my work and got ready for the final incision into the uterus. This was so exciting. I was going to bring a new life into the world, then steal it away instantly. This child was going to die before his birth. Such a disparate action. He was going to get murdered before he was going to get born. Oh, and I knew he was a he. I looked once more at the textbook and reached a blade into the body to cut into the uterus. I would have to be very careful in order not to cut the baby, I should imagine. I was not sure. I was no surgeon. I'd never done this before. Suddenly a flood of amniotic fluid, I assume, spilt down her belly. Maybe I'd accidentally cut the bladder, I wasn't sure. Then I noticed it. The small human inside the large one, like a Russian nesting doll. I reached into the uterus and grabbed the tiny arm that I could see and pulled it until the arm came out of the body. It was amazing. The mother at this point was screaming as well as she could with her wired jaw. But I wasn't interested in her. I was interested in this new life. Pulling on the arm did not get the baby out of the woman as the head got stuck inside the incision. I reached my hand into her and had to grope inside and grab the head to force it out of the abdomen. The belly deflated like a balloon, and the woman gasped, a guttural sound as the baby came into the world. It was silent. So I turned it upside down by its feet and gave it a couple of gentle smacks on the back. This is how we get fluid off the lungs, I think. I saw it on a film. Mother did not react well to this treatment of her offspring in front of her. Little did she realise that I was trying to revive the little bastard. She shook and strained to get off the cross. Her flesh was tearing at the wired points, and the pain she endured meant nothing in order to try and save her newborn. I swung the baby in front of her and smiled at her discomfort. She was now shouting at me. She wanted to kill me. She wanted to hurt me. It was amazing. This must be a mother's love. I mean, she had never seen this little bag of flesh before, so why care to this degree? Fucking human hormones are so wonderful. As I shook the child, it began to cry. Wah, wah, wah. The mother went silent and slumped at the noise. Tears were streaming from her face. Her body was in convulsions. Abject horror at what she saw. I gripped the umbilical cord that was still linked to the placenta that was in the uterus. I wrenched on it, and the bloody mass came out and hit the floor. At this abuse, her body had tensed up again, and she had once more let out a cry of loss, a cry of horror. Now she hung slumped while I inspected the babe. It was a little boy, so I showed her and mouthed, "Boy," and gave her a thumbs up. I gave her a big smile of approval. Her weeping became even more profound for a few moments. She went completely limp. She knew it was a boy, but she obviously wanted a girl. What a shame. Well, that was fun, I thought to myself, but I had to then think of some way to finish the piece. I held the baby in my two hands and brought it up to the mother's face. I offered her the child. Her eyes at first were in doubt that this was the case, but I continued to nod and smile as she looked at it. I was waiting for the moment of love to become obvious on her face. She looked at the child, her eyes glazed, staring into its beautiful face. It wasn't beautiful, it was very bloody. For a moment, it seemed that the eyes of the infant locked with hers. The moment of combined recognition where mother and son realised that the other was there. This was nonsense, of course. Those baby eyes wouldn't be able to focus on anything for a very long while. The mother protector, the son, the progeny of her love, maybe. It was a moment of joy that could not really be measured in time. It seemed to be an infinite moment of joy shared by the two of them. Breaking that moment, I swung the boy by his legs, smashing his little head on the floor. Thanks for listening. That was a particularly sick one, but you need to know about my art. Bye. I love you.
Brought to you in association with Grendel Press. This is Werewolf the Podcast, a serial killer drama.